going by your catalog because we switched some people around. Tonight we have John Pinto, who is the Howard Crosby Butler Professor of History of Architecture at Princeton. Next week we have Robbie George. So if you came because you thought it was Professor George, it's Professor Pinto. Stay! Absolutely. And next week, when people come to hear Professor Pinto, will say, we're very sorry, he came last week. Anyway, Professor Pinto came to Princeton in 1988 from Smith College. He did his graduate and undergraduate work at Harvard. He specializes in Italian Renaissance and Baroque architecture with a focus on Rome. This spring, he will be giving the prestigious Jerome Lectures at the University of Michigan and the American Academy in Rome. Publications include Hadrian's Villa and its legacy, and the Trevi Fountain. And tonight's lecture is entitled Utopian Theory and Practice in the Italian Renaissance. Please welcome Professor Pinto.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure that this mic is working. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. That's one piece of our technology that is in order. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and share with you my thoughts about utopias, but also cities in the period of the Italian Renaissance. I know it's something of a tradition with these lectures for speakers to recommend additional readings. As you'll readily see, I'm a rather more visual person, and my strong recommendation to those of you who might wish to pursue some of the issues that I will be discussing is to walk a very short distance to the Art Museum, where you will find through January 11th a wonderful little exhibition on the subject of the Italian Renaissance city. And you will see there quite a fascinating range of images culled from Princeton's very extensive collection of rare books and manuscripts that, so to speak, I think will amplify and develop some of the points that I'll be making in the lecture. Now, as a historian of architecture and urbanism, I like to think that architecture molds society, just as architecture in its turn is shaped by prevailing forces within society. Both from temperament and training, I gravitate more towards the concrete than the abstract, more towards images, as I just mentioned, than texts. But I have to acknowledge that in the case of Renaissance Italy, we're dealing with a culture that tended not to insist so much on such distinctions. Whether one prefers to consult texts, such as Alberti's architectural treatise, maybe I should address the light here for a moment. Let's take it down. Those pretty clear now? Excellent. Whether one prefers to consult texts, such as Alberti's architectural treatise from the mid-15th century, or Machiavelli's prints, or instead to look at monumental civic structures of the period, such as the Ducal Palace at Urbino on the left, or the neighborhood of the Palazzo Farnese in Rome on the right, one overarching reality emerges. Utopian schemes and exercises in city planning both reflected prevailing assumptions about the hierarchical nature of society. As Alberti put it, and here I'm quoting, certain buildings are appropriate for the public as a whole, others for the higher members of society, the others for the lower ones. For Alberti, the ideal city was one in which design was imposed from the top down, through the collaboration of a ruler and his architectural advisor. And for architectural advisor, read Alberti. He was in effect writing his job description in writing this book. These these views, that is to say about the hierarchical nature of Renaissance society, were accompanied in Alberti's text by other suggestions about residential and industrial zoning that are utopian only in the sense of being applied in a comprehensive and a systematic way. The Renaissance city was no workers' paradise. In much the same way, buildings and civic centers that are often viewed as expressions of Renaissance order, such as the Florentine Bargello. Here we need just a little bit of focus on the left. This looks pretty blurry to me down here. I wonder if I can do that. Ooh, I'm getting a little worse. Let's try it this way. Ooh. Look better?
Yes.
We'll get it fixed, and then they should be remain that way. Excellent. Okay. So many of these civic centers that we associate with Renaissance order, like the Bargello, which you see on the left, and the Piazza della Signoria on the right in Florence. These spaces and these buildings often provided the background for scenes of violence and oppression. The exterior walls of the Bargello were used, quite literally, to hang prisoners up to public view. And if you look very closely, you can see one poor fellow who's hanging up there. And this in a print from the 18th century, just to drive home the point that this practice endured quite a long time. The crenellated skyline of the Palazzo della Signoria offered security to the city fathers, not so much against attack from without, as from the revolt of the very citizens they governed. In 1497, the Piazza della Signoria provided the setting for Savonarola's execution. That's the event that you see depicted here. He's being burned at the stake. The auto da fe, one might say, of a utopian movement, if ever there was one. This evening, what I want to explore is the dynamic tension between universal, theoretical, and utopian concerns on the one hand, and local, contextual ones on the other. We'll see, I think, that most schemes that could be characterized as ideal or utopian represent the work of individuals, while most executed projects reveal extensive collaboration and compromise. Apart from a few quotations from Alberti, my text will primarily be graphic images, or will be written in bricks and mortar, embracing roughly a century between 1450 and 1550. We'll look at two sets of case studies. The first representing ideal schemes, and the second, examples of contextual urbanism. As a transition between the two, I'll examine two themes that exerted considerable influence on Renaissance urbanism. Shifts in military technology affecting the security of cities is one of those, and the presentation of the city as a stage is the other. First, Alberti, from whom we've already heard a quotation, whose extremely influential book, the De Re Edificatoria, or On the Art of Building in 10 books, was roughly finished around the early 1450s, just to situate you here. And in this book, we find just a wonderful compilation of prevailing attitudes on the design and the structure of cities, both in the physical sense and in the social sense. And many of these are gathered together in the fourth book or chapter. And I just want to quote one or two passages for you. The first is this one. Everyone, Alberti writes, relies on the city and all the public services that it contains. If we have concluded rightly from what the philosophers say, that cities owe their origin and their existence to their enabling their inhabitants to enjoy a peaceful life, as free from any inconvenience or harm as possible, then surely the most thorough consideration would be given to the city's layout, site, and outline. And that comes just about as close to a description of a utopia as I believe you can find in Alberti. This notion that almost as an entitlement, the citizens of a city should enjoy a peaceful life and be free from inconvenience and harm. Alberti then goes on to address a number of very important considerations. How should cities be sited in order to assure this peace and this healthful environment? He then goes on to make another observation, which I quote. "It is understandable," he writes, "that the outline of a town and the distribution of its parts will need to vary according to location. In mountains, for example, it is clearly impossible to lay out walls in a circle, rectangle, or whatever shape you choose, as you might on a level and open plain." End of that quotation. Now this is interesting because, in fact, it argues for a very site-specific approach to urban design. Not a one-size-fits-all recipe, not a universal, not an all-embracing prescription, but one which is sensitive to the requirements of a given site. And it's precisely this friction or this dynamic interplay between the urge within the period of the Renaissance to draft and even execute comprehensive, universal, even utopian schemes, and the realities of climate, of site, of pre-existing structures. Most cities in this period were not built anew. Most cities, indeed the majority of them that flourished in Europe in this period, had been Roman city foundations, foundations made in the period of classical antiquity. So no architect really was going to have an opportunity to begin with a tabula rasa situation. And my remarks this evening from now on are really going to be directed at exploring with you this friction, this relationship between the ideal and the utopian on the one hand, and the contextual and the local on the other. As I've been speaking, you had on the screen Alberti's self-portrait, which you see in that wonderful medallion on the right, and one version in the form of an illuminated manuscript of his book, from which I have just been quoting. Now we go forward, and I think it's important to remark that a figure such as Alberti also was not constructing his theoretical edifice, his theoretical remarks on architecture and on city planning out of nothing. He was quite consciously building on the traditions of the past, and in particularly on the inheritance of the classical world. And this is very evident in the structure of his book, which is based on the structure of the architectural treatise written by the ancient Roman author Vitruvius in the first years of the Christian era. Vitruvius's text had survived into the Renaissance, and for this reason it was much studied. However, the illustrations that had, we think, originally accompanied the text did not. And I often argue or propose to my students that Vitruvius would never have been as influential as he has proved to be if those illustrations had survived. Because in their absence, one generation after another of scholars and also creative artists have had to imagine and recreate and reconstruct what they think, or what they thought, I should say, he was saying. And just to provide you with an example of this, I show you two Renaissance versions of what Vitruvius has to say about the city. One of them, I think you can see, the example on the left, which is from a wonderful Milanese printed edition of 1521. This is one of the books which is on display in the Art Museum across the way. Clearly shows the Roman city as being polygonal or circular in plan. The outer radius, the outer arc, I should say, is composed of features, you can just make them out, which represent the prevailing winds. And those, of course, correspond as well to the directions of the compass. This has much to do with Vitruvius's views that cities should be sited in such a way that they enjoy the benefits of good winds, which bring with them health, and they avoid the disadvantages of bad winds, which bring disease and pestilence. Now, on the right, you see another reconstruction of the Vitruvian scheme by an antiquarian scholar named Fra Giocondo, which does not employ, as you can readily see, a polygonal or a circular plan, but rather one that is grid-like, foursquare, and in fact resembles much more closely what we know to be the appearance of ancient Roman cities from archaeological investigations. This is simply to suggest that in thinking about cities, both in their physical form but also in their way in which they mold society, Renaissance writers and builders were very mindful of the classical tradition and the past. Now, I want to move us at this point from Alberti to another 15th century figure, a man named Antonio Averlino, who went by the nickname of Filarete, lover of truth. Filarete was a very gifted figural artist, a sculptor. He was an accomplished architect. And rather like Alberti had, he wrote as well, with a view towards advancing his career, we would say today, with a view towards capturing the eye and the ear of powerful rulers who had the resources to employ him. And in Italy at this time, we're talking about the 1460s now, perhaps the most powerful, certainly one of them, was Francesco Sforza in Milan. And Filarete wrote this book, which unfolds as a kind of dialogue between the architect and the enlightened ruler. And the architect is basically coaching him on what, as a good ruler, he should do to found cities in a proper way. And I want to show you the scheme that Filarete proposes, which I think you can see is highly geometrical in its outline, involving the superimposition of two squares, which are then set within a circle. And then towards the center, in a rather vague, not very precise way, one gathers that a group of monumental public spaces and buildings are gathered. More about that in just a moment. But you can see that the conception is highly abstract and all-encompassing. What you see on the left is Filarete's version of how this city, which he called Sforzinda, after his patron's family name, the Sforza dynasty, how it should be situated in relation to water and the landscape generally. Now what I want to do is take you into the core of the city by looking at two drawings that reflect Filarete's thinking. And let's look first at the one on the left. I realize that these drawings are a little abstract and somewhat difficult to read, but they turn out to be quite revealing. So let me help you read them. It helps a great deal if you understand that these squiggles that you see here are intended to represent arcades, arches on top of columns. So this, for example, is an open space surrounded by a portico, or an arcade. And the porticos and the arcades extend throughout the design, linking the various pieces. Now, we can use a drawing like this, which represents one of the two principal centers of Sforzinda, to gain some insight, I think, into the values of the period. It is perhaps somewhat unsettling to realize that the largest single edifice in this scheme is a prison. Is this utopian? You tell me. We also notice that among the other buildings that define the square, we have a palace dedicated to an outsider, whose, that is to say, someone from outside the town, whose role it was to ensure order. The presence of the church is quite evident. I'll skip over some of these, but you'll notice this structure which has a Latin tag, Tarpea, which is a reference to a cliff off of which offenders were thrown in ancient Rome. This is a place of execution. So we start to add these things up. Prison, place of execution. Here we have an edifice that would have kept and kept safely the wealth of the city, its treasury. Here a customs house, which tells us something about the notions of trade. And here, very importantly, a structure given over to the minor guilds. So we have a great range then in this public square of indications as to how various constituent elements of this polity would have been accommodated. The other principal square was a market square. And clearly Filarete's thinking here was influenced somewhat by his knowledge of Northern European market centers, which made great use of water canals to move merchandise. And here again, I'm not going to identify every structure, but you can see that central to the whole square is a church, and then on one side of it we have a piazza where vegetables and fruits are to be sold, an open market. Up here, an area where grain is to be sold. But very interesting, and this is a clear indication that Filarete is concerned to stimulate commerce, especially from without. We see provisions for foreigners, that is to say non-natives of the city, for occasional layovers. This might be the equivalent, perhaps, in our modern global society of the hotels that spring up near every airport. Here, then, such an inn, a bathing place where they could cleanse themselves is also present. And this is a house of Venus, which is a very high-minded way of referring to a brothel. Another, it's hard to say whether this was an enticement or a provision for these visitors and others. A very large piazza for the sale of wine, and here a house of Bacchus, which can only be a tavern. So you get the picture, I think, if you put these two piazzas together, of an ideal city structured very much around poles of authority, structured around a desire for commerce, and structured around a very clear imposition of an all-informing geometry. Now, there's one other quite wonderful structure that Filarete recommended be constructed in Sforzino, and that is the remarkable edifice that you see in these two drawings, one of which shows its exterior, the other which is a kind of cutaway of its inside. This is the so-called Temple of Virtue and Vice, the purpose of which was to add to the moral perfection of the citizens. It's some 10 stories high, and it contained lecture rooms like this one, apparently, or was to contain them. And this is very interesting. Once again, at the bottom, there was a brothel. But on the upper stories, there was an academy of learning. And the idea was that you gradually made your way from vice to virtue, and culminating on the top where there were pavilions given over to astrology. So the notion, which really isn't too far from our modern notion of the university, that you might have all of these functions contained within a single edifice or within a single campus. We don't have to think back too far to a time when Nassau Hall did indeed embrace the entire university, if not such a rich range of opportunities. Now, at this point, I'd like to move us from Filarete to Leonardo da Vinci, whose projects relating to the design and layout of cities are quite remarkable and astonishing. And I want to use Leonardo for several purposes, but the first of them, suggested by these two drawings by him, watercolors to be more accurate about it, is to suggest another very important Renaissance development. Namely, one that we associate with the empirical study of nature, the concern that the use of scientific instruments, for example, might be applied to measuring in a very accurate way all manner of things, everything from the human body, anatomy, if you will, to botanical specimens, to cities and whole districts. On the left, I'm showing you a wonderful map, in a fashion, of a portion of Tuscany. This is the Tyrrhenian coast here, and you can see the watersheds, the Apennine mountain range. And while we tend in our popular vision to think of Leonardo as that fellow who worked on a flying machine, it's important to recognize that he never achieved this, and yet what he achieves in this drawing is very much the impression of being airborne. I'd go so far as to say that in certain respects it resembles some of the remarkable images we've seen returned from space. This ability, in other words, in the first place, to distance oneself from one's surroundings and view those in an empirical and an objective way. When that is applied to the city, it means that a whole manner of concerns that formerly had been treated separately or as distinct problems can be treated in a more comprehensive and a more coordinated way. I'm showing you here on the right of the screen a drawing from 1503. Leonardo was shut up in this little town of Imola for a space of time when he was traveling with Cesare Borgia. And they were literally besieged. And so Leonardo set about measuring this city very precisely, using a magnetic compass in order to establish the angles at which various building facets and streets were set. He also invented an odometer, the device that effectively calculates the distance we drive in our cars to measure distances. And he drew all of this up in this remarkable image, which, first of all, flattens everything out. It's a complete abstraction. Even if he were to have been able to fly, this is not something that you can see when you fly. First, because every point that we see on this map is viewed from directly above it. There is no parallax. There is no perspective which you would have if you were airborne or a bird. Secondly, if you look very closely, you'll see that he's cut through the buildings that compose the city. It's a kind of X-ray vision that actually gives you their ground lines. So a tremendous amount of information is being conveyed here. And with this kind of information, architects, designers, planners, and others could consider the city and its different districts and parts in a far more coordinated fashion. This is, of course, exactly what Leonardo and others set about attempting in a number of cases. On the right, I'm showing you a wonderful drawing by Leonardo suggesting how the Arno River, which runs through Florence, might be straightened out to regularize it. Or here, in the case of Milan, which you see both in ground plan and in a perspectival view, how a system of canals might be organized, which would provide ready access both for merchandise and also for the transport of people throughout this center. For the Milanese project, we have a number of more detailed drawings, which are truly remarkable. You see that what Leonardo was envisioning was a multi-layered city, a city that operated, that functioned on a number of different levels. Here you can see a portico. This, by the way, is very much the kind of, like the arcades that Filarete was drawing in his ground plan earlier. A commodious, covered passageway, appropriate for the nobility, appropriate for the citizens, while directly below, at a lower level, a service canal along which goods might be moved and refuse might be disposed of. You can see a similar situation here in the drawing on the right, representing the princely palace and its relationship at multiple levels to these canals. So the harnessing of nature to serve man's ends was certainly another dimension of this kind of study. Now, one of Leonardo's most celebrated drawings, the one on the left, illustrates, of course, a passage from Vitruvius, which talks about how two perfect geometric forms may be generated by the human figure. And in the Christian society, a gloss was put on this reading, which argued that man, or humankind, had been created in God's image, and therefore the human figure and its proportions must, perforce, reflect at least some measure of perfection, of divine perfection. And then, by extension, any geometric figure that was generated by the human figure must also be perfect. And this developed ripple-like outwards until it embraced the entire cosmos. The arcs of the planets were part of this same system. Musical intervals were also determined by mathematical ratios, which were ideal and could be linked back to the human figure. And so one could move from an abstract theoretical statement of the sort that you see on the left to this kind of an arrangement. This is not on the right a drawing by Leonardo, but by his contemporary Francesco di Giorgio Martini. But here you can see a human figure generating the design of a city. The central square is centered on the figure's navel. The cathedral placed directly above the heart. The citadel as a crown on the head, and the whole surrounded by very stout walls. More about those walls in a moment. Let me stay, though, briefly, with this anthropomorphic analogy, because if you accept the argument that every part can and ideally should be related in a harmonious way to the whole, then you really can design a city and have that same order operating at every possible level. We've seen the human figure generating the overall design of a city. Here we see in another drawing by Francesco di Giorgio a human figure generating the design of a church. And here of a capital. And here a young maiden's body generates the slender proportions of the Ionic order. And continuing to stop down in detail, this is one of my favorite drawings by Francesco di Giorgio, how a human profile can generate the profile of a cornice. And the wonderful detail, these features here are known as dentals. And Francesco di Giorgio thought that they must be generated, therefore, by the teeth of the human figure. And so he really bends himself all out of shape to get those dentals lined up with the figure's mouth. All of this is just to demonstrate a compelling and abiding concern in the Italian Renaissance to relate the smallest part to the whole. And this is extremely evident in the design of cities. Now, Francesco di Giorgio, whose drawings we've been looking at, also designed cities. I'm showing you four examples. You can see that they are radial in various ways. Some of them adapt themselves to a hillside site. But one feature they all possess are these very strong walls. And this reflects another very important reality that was operating in the Italian Renaissance, namely the abiding concern for security that we still feel today in our own cities, whether it be concern about attack from without or concern about safety within. Certainly in the late decades of the 15th century, the security, or the presumed security of Italian Renaissance cities had been shattered. And that security was shattered by these devices that you see in this wonderful drawing by Leonardo. And it looks like it really needs a big help. There we go. Oh, I think I popped it out. Sorry. There we go. Good. Leonardo is showing us here basically an artillery park, a depot where these engines of war are being constructed, where they're being stored, where they are being mounted. And on the right, a wonderful late etching by the German artist Albrecht Dürer shows a portable artillery piece being moved along through the countryside. These engines of war totally transformed the way business was done in cities. Cities which had been safe behind high, thin curtain walls found that those defenses were demolished by these weapons within hours, if not almost. And the result was that new study had to be devoted to providing the appropriate defenses. And old traditional structures had to be rethought. A wonderful example of this is the gateway in Rome. I'm showing you its location here in this overall plan. Set into the 3rd century AD walls. These walls had served Rome very well for over a millennium. Here you see the same gateway in a fresco from the 16th century. When Michelangelo was commissioned to build a gateway here, he did something quite remarkable. Instead of having the gateway face outward towards someone approaching from the countryside, he had it face inward towards the city. It becomes a kind of visual goalpost, and development in the city from its center could then move towards it in the direction of the periphery. The reason this happens is that its value as defense is no longer of any consideration whatsoever. It doesn't matter which way the gateway looks. It doesn't even matter if there is a gateway, because these walls are no longer capable of resisting an attack supported by mobile artillery. If you're going to resist that kind of an attack, you need to have new walls like the ones you see represented here in these ideal schemes for fortified towns. This is another publication which you can see on display in the exhibition across the web. These arrowhead-shaped bastions, as they're known, could not only resist incoming artillery fire because they were hunkered down low and thick, but cannon could be mounted on top of them so that one could counter attacks from without. And of course, enfilading fire could also protect the walls situated between them. What this meant was that vast sums of money were devoted now to circling cities, some old, and in some cases new foundations, like Palma Nova here on the left, so that they could withstand attack. The other feature I'll mention, of course, is the radiating streets. No one could afford to have enough artillery to defend every point around the city's periphery. So what you wanted was the ability to move your guns, if they were over here, across town in a hurry if your enemy showed up here. Hence the radial streets. Is this utopian? I think not. But is this an indication of a concern for security, which Alberti himself posits as one of the principal entitlements and aims of an ideal city? Yes, it is. And we have only to think of our own investments in the early 21st century in defense, both at home and abroad, to connect with these concerns. Well, I want to move us now to my second theme, which is the notion of the city as a stage, which emerges, I think, very clearly in paintings such as these, which for a very long time have been used almost as the poster, if you will, for the ideal Renaissance city in which harmony prevails. You'll notice that there aren't very many people, only a few. In fact, some scholars debate whether these actually date from the period in these images. And a lot of what has been taken for Renaissance harmony in these images operates really in the absence of the hustle and bustle and the activities of everyday life. I think to populate them, to understand them properly, we need to situate in these settings actors. They would often, in many instances, have been viewed as backbones against human action. And this was one way, certainly, in which writers and thinkers conceptualized the city. Let me give you another example. These from yet another book that is on display across the way. This is Sebastiano Serlio's Treatise on Architecture from the 1540s. And here you see two stage sets, one for tragedy and one for comedy. And the notion is that tragic themes require classical architecture and a higher level of decorum, because ultimately tragedy is most fitting for noble figures and noble classes, whereas comedy is very much a lower class kind of thing, and so almost any style will suffice. And you'll see, in fact, there's a tremendous, very conscious richness and diversity of styles here on the right. Both of these images, though, have as their central premise this strong perspectival recession at the center, which corresponds more or less to a great many schemes that were actually constructed, whether as piazzas or as streets. I'll show you two examples in just a moment, but I want first to just call your attention to one of the great theaters that was actually built and still survives in the Renaissance. This is Andrea Palladio's Olympian Theater, the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza from the late 1570s. And here I've taken you up on stage as if you were an actor, and you're able to look back behind the proscenium to other forms, which in fact evoke the city, a cityscape. Now, when Palladio designed this theater late in his life, he was able to build on his earlier efforts at illustrating the text of Vitruvius. And here on the left, you see his reconstruction of the ancient theater according to Vitruvius. And there again, you'll see the way in which, through the archways, one saw, according to Palladio, one was expected to see, the presence of the city. So this linkage of theater and city is a very important one. Just as two examples of this, chosen almost at random, here the Via Giulia in Rome, dating from the first decades of the 16th century, a long straight street, defined, much as in Serlio's prints, by a variety of different buildings. Or here in Genoa, from the middle of the 16th century, the Strada Nuova, a very similar development, in which the buildings have architectural characters of their own, and engage with one another in a kind of dialogue. Now, this brings me to my conclusion and to these two brief case studies of contextual urbanism. The first has to do with the small town of Pienza, situated in southern Tuscany, which in the 1460s was transformed because a native son had become pope. And Pius II, Piccolomini, lavished money on his hometown, which really was a single street town, to transform it, or part of it, into a new, up-to-date center. You can see a detailed plan of that civic center, dominated by the cathedral, and defined largely by the family palace, by the bishop's palace, and by another edifice that accommodated the civil guard. And I want to take you into this scheme so that you can see that it is very much the product of negotiation between pre-existing structures and new ones. It's the result of compromise. It's also evidence of a considerable degree, not of uniformity, but of diversity. Here, the aerial view gives you perhaps a slightly better sense of the skewed relationship of these buildings. These are not right angles. This is not an orthogonal relationship. And that has much to do with the pre-existing property lines and foundation lines. There on the right, you can see the cathedral, which in terms of its style actually harkens to examples in Germany, where the Pope had served in an earlier stage in his career. Let me show you two other buildings, two other views of the square. Here we're anchored on the right by the cathedral facade, and we're looking in the opposite direction to the building that accommodated basically the police force, and here to the bishop's palace. Here another view of the bishop's palace. Each of these structures is designed in a different style. This isn't about imposing a single style on the city, but rather celebrating, we would say today, the diversity of styles possible at that time. And here, finally, two views of the Pope's family palace, with its bench in front, there to accommodate the citizens who would come occasionally to draw, well, come regularly, I should say, to draw water at this wonderful well. If you want to look for a local Princeton variation on this theme, go to Brown Hall, one of the dormitories on campus, and you will see that the architect in the 1890s, wishing to treat young Princetonian men as if they were aristocrats of the Italian Renaissance, provided them with a bench outside their dormitory. Now, the other example, and the one I want to end with, is the Capitoline Hill in Rome. While Pienza was the work of the 15th century, of the 1460s, the reorganization of the Capitoline Hill by Michelangelo was the work of the 1530s and later. And I show you the aerial view because it's important to recognize where the Capitoline was and is. Immediately north of the ancient Roman Forum. That's the area we can see here in this Renaissance plan. And Michelangelo's task was to redefine this square as the center of city government, to, in effect, reorient it away from the Rome of the Caesars and redirect it to the Rome of the popes, and to integrate it as well into a processional route that proceeded from the Vatican to the Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome, so that the Pope and his entourage could readily pass over the hill. This program involved, once again, a great deal of negotiation and compromise. Here, a drawing from the 1550s shows you some of the problems associated with the site. First off, this was a very muddy slope to get up on horseback or even on foot. So one of the concerns that he was addressing was simply facilitating access. Secondly, the two buildings that existed on the site before he arrived were not set at right angles to one another. And moreover, they were not symmetrical. This offended prevailing Renaissance notions of symmetry. Michelangelo's solution is to place in a central position a monument, a bronze equestrian monument from the ancient world, to surround it with a swirling pavement pattern which would mask the non-right-angled relationship of these buildings, to construct a third building in a place where there had been none, which would mirror or reflect its counterpart on the other side, and then to give the two pre-existing buildings, as well as the third new building, a facelift, which would involve applying to them an architectural veneer of the classical orders that effectively unified them visually. So order was achieved here, but it's a skin-deep order. But it is an order, and this I really insist upon, that is immensely respectful of the structures that had existed on the site before. Michelangelo maintains, for example, this portico that was a very important feature of this building. Within this portico, the guild offices had their place, and they have their place in the new scheme. But the whole is given a new, far more monumental appearance and character. The figure of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius astride his horse is a direct allusion to the ancient past, which so fired the imagination of Renaissance rulers. And his presence, the presence of that statue, striding now, looking out and addressing the new city of the popes, effectively reoriented the entire square, transforming it. Now this is incremental urbanism. It's not redefining the entire city, but this is the way urban design proceeded for the most part during the Renaissance. And it's with this example that I'll leave you, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any. Was vested in the Pope, but it was convenient use them, as it were. And the restructuring of the site was, in one sense, a kind of sop to their dignity, or a nice pat on the back. Did people benefit particularly from this? I can't honestly tell you that they did, beyond enjoying a beautiful environment. It was not like bringing a new aqueduct to the city, or providing a drain or a fountain. Did not have those beneficial effects. However, I would, now that I think about it, is it so very different from what has happened in Princeton with the construction of the new city hall? Have we benefited? This is a charged question, I know, but I'll put it out there for you. In some respects, we have, I'm sure. In others, one could look at it as an exercise in spending that might have been directed elsewhere.
Actually, what I meant was there any spoken or written intention spoken that when this was done, the people would be, or some people, or maybe some rich people, or who knows which people, would be happier, would lead more satisfactory lives?
I don't believe happier or more satisfactory lives were mentioned. Certainly, there are written statements on several sides that say that the city magistrates will be more productively and appropriately housed. There is the clear indication that the Pope and his retinue, when they pass over the hill in procession, will be able to do so without getting their feet muddy, and will have an appropriate setting for them. I should add that there was a little bit of an embarrassment that led in part to this work being undertaken. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had come to Rome in triumph and wanted to celebrate a triumph by going up to the Capitoline Hill. And it was so muddy that he couldn't get up there. And this would be the equivalent, I suppose, to an American president, I don't know, inviting a visiting ruler to the White House and not having to be able to get there. So it was more about decorum, civic decorum, and a sense of appropriate dignity than it was, I think, about providing for public well-being. I put it that way. Please.
Facilities that they have, sanitary facilities.
Well, I'm extremely interested in those questions, as was Alberti. I attended to, in those few brief quotations I mentioned, they didn't come up, but he has an extensive section devoted to drains and sewers, and he's very clear about good drainage being absolutely essential to a healthy, successful city. And so much for the theory. Many of these cities were very effectively drained and provided for. The model usually went back to Roman examples. Many of them continued to function in the Renaissance. Many cities in this period, however, were appallingly ill-served by their drainage systems. Siena is an example that visitors would go and constantly comment on the stench and the failure of the drainage to operate. But certainly, everyone who wrote about, provided prescriptions and theoretical guidelines for the design and layout of cities, emphasized drainage. People were aware of this, but these were very expensive public works, and they were not always carried out, especially in the poorer districts, with the vigor that we would like to see them pursue.
In a place like that, you would have how many people per major? Thousands of people be there?
No, you could never gather more probably than, well, at most maybe 1,200 or so. I once, when I was considerably younger, stood in this piazza and heard John F. Kennedy address the crowd from this position. And I think it wasn't well advertised. I don't think there could have been more than about 800 or 1,200 people. It's not really designed to gather large crowds. There are other spaces, St. Peter's Square, for example, that had that function more in mind. A modest crowd might gather here to hear a proclamation, but the purpose really isn't that of an amphitheater.
So you would have public toilets?
Oh, certainly not. No provisions. No. In such accommodations were virtually unknown in Renaissance Rome. You might, you would certainly have had in some princely dwellings what we would refer to euphemistically as water closets, but public facilities of that sort, none.
Or where do people go?
Out back, outhouses, cesspools, you name it. However, in the case of Rome, because its infrastructure of drainage survived in part from classical antiquity, and also because as the Renaissance progressed and we get into the 16th century, large quantities of water were available. That meant that a lot of this refuse was removed on a regular basis. But not every city was as fortunate as Rome in having so much water available and having the survival of these engineering works. Yes?
So in the Renaissance cities, was all building dictated by the administration, or was there any ad hoc builders there on their own?
There are a range of different answers to that question. It depends very much on where you are and at what point in time you are. So that, for example, a model that operates in Florence isn't necessarily the model that would operate in Rome or in Venice. But generally speaking, you have, planning boards and municipal officials who are charged with licensing new work. So most of us, let's consider ourselves, free house owners. If we wanted to put an addition on, we would basically have to get a license, much as we would have to do in Princeton today. And for that license, we would be taxed. We would have to pay something. And it would be regulated more or less. For the nobility, and especially for a ruler like the Pope or the Duke of Urbino, none of those restrictions apply. And expropriation and all sorts of other activities which led to the appropriation of land and expansion and the like happened wholesale. There also are models, Genoa, that street that I showed you is one such example, where you have a group of aristocrats who are operating more or less in common. And they don't exactly produce a gated community, but they produce a very high-class neighborhood, entry into which is strictly controlled. So there are a lot of different models that operate. Sometimes the municipal offices would say, oh, you want to build a wing there? Okay, we'll allow you to do that, but we'd like you in return to give us another piece of property that perhaps impinges on public land. That's one of the ways streets got widened. So there are a whole range of models there.
Did Michelangelo base that design on something before, or was that just created?
You mean the scheme of the three palaces, or particularly the spiral? The pattern, right. That's a wonderful example of the ways in which the site on the Capitoline Hill powerfully influenced him. There was a tradition according to which this was the navel of the world. This was the center of the world. And it may not be evident in this slide, but in fact the pavement rises slightly up to the center. There was another tradition according to which patterns like this, which are generated by intersecting circles, had to do, once again, with notions of centrality and importance. And so by placing the statue at the center of that pavement, he's making a nod to the ancient world, and he's saying, in effect, that once again Rome, and perhaps by extension the city magistrates, have returned to a position of central importance. So yeah, there's a lot of, I didn't get into what I would say they call the iconography or the expressive dimension of this square, but you can see the profusion of statues and sculpture there, and every one of those adds to the meaning of the site. Yes?
Do you think that the discovery of perspective had any influence on the physical and social organization of the Renaissance?
Certainly the physical organization, there's no question about it, and that's one of the things that I was alluding to when I mentioned that new patterns of, I tended to stress the empirical study and the measuring of the site, but when I was talking about coordination and the integration and the relation of one part to the whole, that's perspective. Because what the perspective system does is it gives you a mathematical way to relate the tiniest element to the whole scheme in proportional terms. And you could take every one of those representations that I showed you under the heading of the city as theater. They are demonstrations of perspective, or if you will, they're applications of the perspectival system to the representation of and the conceptualization of cities. So absolutely 100% yes. Please.
Was there any thought to planning for expansion in these layouts?
Absolutely. I showed you one example when we looked at the gate that Michelangelo set in place so that it would face inward towards the city. That was at the end of a very long street that was extended out from the center of the city where Rome was densely built up. But along that long street, there were no buildings originally. There are a number of reasons for this. It was on an upper elevation. Water had not been available there, and so people were discouraged from building. The Pope brought water, and he laid out the street, and within a few decades, it was lined with buildings. So that would be one example of planning for expansion. One of the things that greatly hindered such plans for expansion was really the tyranny of these massive walls that you needed to defend yourself. And it's not an uncommon picture, or it's not an uncommon formula to see successive rings of walls. It's very evident in the case of Florence, which expanded 3 or 4 times. And each time it expanded, the walls had to be broken down, and then a new one's set outside. Basically, growth out from a center was the most common pattern. But there were other patterns, such as the one that I showed you in Genoa, where a new quarter would be basically pushed out along a street. So a number of different models, but growth was a very important consideration. By and large, with a few blips, this was a period in which populations were growing quite remarkably. Rome moves from about a low of about 30,000 in the 1440s to perhaps as many as 150,000 a century later. So that's a big leap.